Chapter 9. Lanterns lit the study, old brass lanterns that burned with charter magic in place of oil, smokeless, silent, and eternal. They provided as good a light as the electric bulbs of Ancestier. Books lined the walls, following the curves of the tower around, save for where the stair rose from below, and the ladder climbed to the observatory above. A redwood table sat in the middle of the room, its legs scaled and beady-eyed, ornamental flames licking from the mouths of the dragon heads that gripped each corner of the tabletop. An inkwell, pens, paper, and a pair of bronze map dividers lay upon the table. Chairs of the same red wood surrounded it, their upholstery black with a variation on the silver key motif. The table was one of the few things Sabriel remembered from her childhood visits. Dragon desk, her father had called it, and she'd wrapped herself around one of those dragon legs, her head not even reaching the other side of the table. Sabriel ran her hand over the smooth, cold wood, feeling better both her memory of it and the current sensation. Then she sighed, pulled up a chair, and put down the 3 books she'd tucked under her arm. 2 she had put close to her, and the other she pushed to the center of the table. This 3rd book came from the single glassed-in cabinet among the bookshelves, and now lay like some quiescent predator, possibly asleep, possibly waiting to spring. Its binding was of a pale green leather, and charter marks burned on the silver clasp that held it closed. The Book of the Dead. The other 2 books were normal enough by comparison. Both were charter magic spell books, listing mark after mark and how they could be used. Sabriel didn't even recognize most of the marks after Chapter 4 in the first book. There were 20 chapters in each volume. Doubtless, there were many other chapters that would be useful, Sabriel thought, but she still felt too tired and shaky to get more down. She planned to talk to Mogget, then study for about an hour or 2 before going back to bed. Even 4 or 5 waking hours seemed too much after her ordeal, and the loss of consciousness involved in sleep suddenly seemed very appealing. Mogget, as if he had heard Sabriel thinking of himself, appeared at the top of the steps and saucered over to sprawl on a well-upholstered footstand. "I see you found that book," he said, tail flickering backwards and forwards as he spoke. "Take care you do not read too much." "I've already read it all, anyway," Sabriel replied shortly. "Perhaps," remarked the cat, "but it isn't always the same book. Like me, it is several things, not one." Sabriel shrugged, as if to show that she knew all about the book, but that was just a bravado. The inner Sabriel was afraid of the Book of the Dead. She had worked her way through every chapter under her father's direction, but her normally excellent memory held only selected pages of this tome. If it changed its contents as well, she suppressed a shiver and told herself that she knew all that was necessary. "My first step must be to find my father's body," she said. "Which is where I need your help, Mogget." "I have no knowledge of where he met his end," Mogget stated. with finality. He yawned and started licking his paws. Sabriel frowned and found herself pulling in her lips, a characteristic she had deplored in the unpopular history teacher at school, who often went thin-lipped in anger or exasperation. Just tell me where you last saw him and what his plans were. Why don't you read his diary? Mogget suggested, in a momentary break from cleansing himself. Where is it? Asked Sabriel, excited. A diary would be tremendously helpful. He probably took it with him, replied Mogget. I haven't seen it. I thought you had to help me, Sabriel said, another frown wrinkling across her forehead, reinforcing the thin lips. Please answer my question. 3 weeks ago, Mogget mumbled, mouth half muffled in the fur of his stomach, pink tongue alternating between words and cleansing. A messenger came from Balazar, begging for his help. Something dead. Something that could pass the wards. Was preying on them. Abhorsen, the previous Abhorsen, ma'am, suspected that there was more to it than that. Balazar being Balazar, but he went. Balazar. The name's familiar. It's a town? A city. The capital. At least it was, when there was still a kingdom. Was? Mogget stopped washing and looked across, eyes narrowing to frowning slits. What did they teach you in that school? There hasn't been a king or queen in 200 years. And why? Not even the regent for 20. That's why the kingdom sinks day by day into a darkness from which no one will rise. The charter, Sabriel began, but Mogget interrupted with a yowl of derision. The charter crumbles too, he mewed. Without a ruler, charter stones broken, one by one with blood. One of the great charters twisted. What do you mean, one of the great charters? Sabriel interrupted in turn. She had never heard of such a thing. Not for the first time. She also wondered what she'd been taught in school, and why her father had kept so quiet about the state of the old kingdom. But Mogget was silent, as if the thing he'd had already said had stopped his mouth. For the moment, he seemed to be trying to form words, but nothing came from his small red mouth. Finally he gave up. I cannot tell you. It's part of my binding, curse it. Suffice to say that the whole world's sliding into evil, and many are helping the slide. And the others resist it, said Sabriel, like my father, like me. It depends what you do, Mogget said, as if he doubted that someone was as patiently useless as Sabriel would make much difference. Not that I care. The sound of the trapdoor opening above their heads stopped the cat in mid-speech. Sabriel tensed, looking up to see what was coming down the ladder. Then started breathing again as she realized it was only another charter sending, its black habit flopping over the rungs of the ladder as it came down. This one, like the guards on the cliff corridor, but unlike the other house servants, had a silver key emblazed on its chest and back. It bowed to Sabriel and pointed up. With a feeling of foreboding, Sabriel knew that it wanted her to look at something from the observatory. Reluctantly, she pushed her chair back and went over to the ladder. A cold draft was blowing in through the open trapdoor, carrying with it the chill of ice and from further up the river. Sabriel shivered, and her hands touched the cold metal rungs. Emerging into the observatory, the chill passed, for the room was still lit by the last red light of the setting sun, giving an illusion of warmth that making Sabriel squint. She had no memory of this room. It was with the light that she saw that it was totally walled in glass, or something like it. The bare beams of the red-tiled roof rested on transparent walls, so cleverly morticated together that the roof was like a work of art, complete with the slight draft that reduced its imperfection. Oh, sorry. That it reduced. Complete with the slight draft that reduced its perfection to a more human level. The large telescope of gleaming glass and bronze dominated the observatory, standing triumphant on a tripod of dark wood and darker iron. A tall observer's stool stood next to it, and a lectern, a star chart still spilled across it. A thick, wriggled, inviting carpet lay under all, a carpet that was also a map of the heavens, showing many different, colorful constellations and whirling planets, woven in thick, richly dyed wool. The Sending, who had followed Sabriel, went to the south wall and pointed out towards the southern river bank, its pallid, charter-drawn hand indicating the very spot where Sabriel had emerged after her underground flight from the Mordicant. Sabriel looked there, shielding her right eye from the west-falling sun. Her gaze crossed the white tops of the river and was drawn to the ledge, despite an inner quailing about what she would see. As she feared, the Mordicant was still there, but with what she had come to think of as her death sight, Sabriel sensed it was quiescent, temporary, just an unpleasant statue, a foreground to other, more actively shapes that bustled about it in some activity behind. Sabriel stared a little longer, then went to the telescope, narrowly avoiding Mogget, who had somehow appeared underfoot. Sabriel wondered how he got up the ladder, then dismissed the thought as she concentrated on what was happening outside. Unaided, she hadn't been certain what the shapes around the Mordicant were, but they sprang sharply at her through the telescope, drawn so close she felt she could somehow lean forward and snatch them away. They were men and women, living, breathing people. Each was shackled to a partner's leg by an iron chain, and then shuffled about in these pairs under the dominating presence of the Mordicant. There were scores of them, coming out of the corridor, carrying heavily laden leather buckets or lengths of timber, taking them across the ledge and down to the steps of the river. Then they filed back up again, buckets empty, timbers left behind. Sabriel depressed the telescope a little, and almost growled in exasperation and anger as she saw the scene by the river. More living slaves were hammering long boxes together from the timber, and these boxes were being filled with earth from the buckets. As each box was filled, it was pushed out to the bridge, out to bridge the gap from the shore to Stepping Stone, and locked in place by slaves hammering iron spikes into the stone. This particular part of the operation was being directed by something that lurked well back from the river. Halfway up the steps, a man-shaped blob of blackest night, a moving silhouette, a necromancer's shadow hand, or some free-will dead spirit that scorned the use of a body. As Sabriel watched, the last of the 4 boxes was thrust out to the first stepping stone, spiked in place, and then chained to the 3 adjacent fellows. One slave, fastening the chain, overbalanced and went headfirst into the waters, his shacklemate following a second later. Their screams, if any, were drowned by the roar of the waterfall as its waters took their bodies. A few seconds later, Sabriel felt their lives snuffed out. The other slaves at the river's edge stopped working for a moment, either shocked at their sudden loss or momentarily made more afraid of the river by their masters. But the shadow hand on the steps moved towards them, its legs like treacle pouring down the slope, lapping over each step it turned. It gestured for some of the nearer slaves to walk across the earth-filled boxes to the stepping stone. So they did. They did so, to cluster unhappily amid the spray. The shadow hand hesitated then, but the mordicant on the ledge above seemed to stir and rock forward a little, so the shadowy abomination gingerly trod on the boxes and walked across to the stepping stone, taking no scathe from the running water. "Grave dirt," commented Moggett, who obviously didn't need a telescope. "Carted up by the villagers from Querry and Robles-town. I wonder if they've got enough to cross all the stones." "Grave dirt?" commented Sabriel bleakly, watching a fresh round of slaves arriving with buckets and more timber. "I had forgotten it could negate the running water. I thought I would be safe here for a time." "Well, you are," said Moggett. "It'll take at least until tomorrow evening before the bridge is complete, particularly allowing for a couple of hours off around noon, when the dead will have to hide if it isn't overcast. But this shows planning, and that means a leader. Still, every Abhorsen has enemies. It may just be a petty necromancer with a better brain for strategy than most." "I slew a dead thing at Cloven Crest," Sabriel said slowly, thinking aloud. "It said it would have its revenge, and spoke of telling the servants of Carrygore. Do you know that name?" "I know it," spat Moggett, tail quivering straight out behind him. "But I cannot speak of it, except to say that he is one of the greater dead, and your father's most terrible enemy. Do not say it lives again." "I don't know," replied Sabriel, looking down at the cat, whose body seemed twisted as if it in turmoil between command and resistance. "Why can't you tell me more? The binding?"
A perversion of the... Yes," Moggett croaked
without effort, though his green eyes seemed to glow luminous and fiery with anger at his own feeble explanation. He could say no more. "Coils within coils," remarked Sabriel thoughtfully. There seemed little doubt that some evil power was working against her. From the moment she'd crossed the wall, or even before that, if her father's disappearance was anything to go by. She looked back at the telescope again, and took some heart in the slowing of the work as the last light faded, though at the same time she felt a pang of sympathy for the poor people the dead had enslaved. Many would probably freeze to death or die of exhaustion, only to be brought back as dull-witted hands. Only those who went over the waterfall would escape that fate. Truly, the old kingdom was a terrible place, when even death did not mean to end to slavery and despair. "Is there another way out?" she asked, swiveling the telescope around 180 degrees to look at the northern bank. There were stepping stones going there too, and another door high on the river bank. But there was also dark shapes clustering on the ledge by the door. 4 or 5 shadow hands, too many for Sabriel to fight through alone. "It seems not," she answered herself grimly. What of defenses then? Can the Sendings fight?"
"The Sendings don't need to fight," replied Mogget, "for there's another defense, though it is a rather constrictive one. And there's one other way out, though you probably won't like it."
The Sending next to her nodded and pantamated at something with its arm that looked like a snake wriggling through grass. "What's that?" asked Sabriel. Oh. "What's that?" asked Sabriel, fighting back sudden urge to break into hysterical laughter. "The defense or the way out?"
"The defense," replied Mogget. "The river itself. It can be invoked to rise almost to the height of the island walls, 4 times your own height, above the stepping stones. Nothing can pass such a flood, in or out, till it subsides, in a matter of weeks."
"And so how would I get out?" asked Sabriel. "I can't wait weeks."
"One of your ancestors built a flying device, a paper wing, she called it. You can use that, launched out over the waterfall."
"Oh," said Sabriel in a little voice.
"If you do not wish to raise the river." "If you do wish to raise the river," Mogget continued, as if he hadn't noticed Sabriel's sudden silence, "then we must begin the ritual immediately. The flood comes from meltwater, and the mountains are many leagues upstream. If we call the waters now, the flood will be down on us by dusk tomorrow."